A Great Argead Saga ALEXEIN, Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Hieroslachus, The Sacred Band. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 12, Piraeus, Shadows Beneath the Olive Groves. October 368 BC, Autumnal Equinox. The first biting north winds of autumn swept down from the jagged peaks of Mount Parnes, stripping the brittle, golden leaves from the ancient olive trees and carrying the damp, rotting stench of open sewage through the suffocating alleys of Athens. In the shadows of the Potter's Quarter near the Dipylon Gate, where the city's industrial refuse met the desperate crush of human misery, the subterranean world operated entirely far from the sight of the city magistrates and their prying astinamoi. Beneath a modest, unassuming stone cottage, rented under a common merchant trade name, Lysandra and Menander oversaw the beating heart of their enterprise. To the impoverished laborers, dockworkers, and wretched refugees crowding the sunlit street above, the pair ran a vital, low-cost haven. A sanctuary offering meager relief from the relentless autumn agues and festering blade wounds of the slums. But beneath the flagstones, descending down a steep, short-up flight of earthen steps slick with condensation, lay their true engine. A labyrinthine network of smuggled tunnels carved deep into the cool, dark clay bedrock. Here, shielded by meters of earth and absolute secrecy, was their drug distribution hub. Stacks of marked ceramic amphorae and heavy cedar wood chests lined the damp, brick-lined walls, holding raw, sticky opium, harvested from foreign Phoenician traders, concentrated henbane, and jars of refined black hellebore potent enough to stop a charging bull or ease a lingering, agonizing death. Menander moved silently through the dim, flickering torchlight, his tall frame bending awkwardly as he ran callous fingers over the wax-coated moisture seals of the export jars. The air down here smelled of rich earth, stale vinegar, and the bitter, earthy tang of dried roots, a stark contrast to the filth of the streets above. If the Council of 500 ever discovers these vaults, every jar of poppy resin will be our death warrant, Menander thought, his chest tightening as a distant wagon rolled over the flagstones overhead, sending a faint tremor through the dirt ceiling. We are trading on the edge of a sword. One loose tongue from a desperate addict, one bribe-hungry city official poking too closely into our inventory, and everything we have built collapses into a public execution. A few paces away, Lysandra stood beside a heavy oak trestle table, meticulously weighing out microdoses of powdered opium on a delicate bronze balance scale. The tiny lead weights clicked softly against the metal pan, a rhythmic clinical cadence that matched the cold calculation humming behind her dark eyes. The fools upstairs think we are saints giving away charity out of the goodness of our hearts, Lysandra mused internally, her lips curling into a razor-thin, sardonic smile as she pinched a fraction of a grain between her thumb and forefinger. Let them pray to Athena and praise our mercy. Mercy doesn't buy safe passage for our cargo runners, and it certainly doesn't secure our monopoly over the Attic underworld. The suffering of the city is an endless tide, and as long as they bleed and cough, our underground arteries will pump silver straight into our coffers. The shipment from the Piraeus docks arrived intact, Menander murmured softly, breaking the rhythmic clinking of the scales as he stepped closer to the table, wiping a smear of dark resin from his thumb. Demetrius managed to slip past the customs guards while they were arguing over a cargo of Thasian wine. But the prices are climbing. The merchants know the autumn fevers are spiking, and they are gouging us on the raw poppy imports. Lysandra did not look up from her balance, her hand steady as she tipped a measure of powder into a folded wax paper packet. Let them gouge us for now, she replied, her voice a cool, level whisper that cut cleanly through the damp air. Pass the cost down to the wealthy clients in the inner Ceramicus, who want their private sedatives, without the city scribes asking questions. We subsidize the clinic upstairs with the blood money of the rich, and we keep the slums just quiet enough not to riot. Menander watched her for a moment, seeing the unyielding steel in her posture. He knew the dark calculus of her mind, yet he also knew it was the only shield standing between them and the brutal poverty of Athens. And the rumors from the southern trade routes? Menander asked quietly, shifting his weight in the shadows as he recalled the harbor gossip. Word came in from the maritime clerks about the Asclepiadean Guild on costs. They say young adepts are finishing their trials and booking passage northward. Lysandra's hand froze for a fraction of a second over the bronze scales. A sharp gleam of intellectual curiosity flashed in her eyes, instantly masking her underlying caution. "They haven't reached our shores yet," she said, her voice dropping lower still. "But when an elite trained physician from the sanctuary finally steps off a ketch and tries to practice in these tenements, he will face a rude awakening. Men schooled in the pure theory of quays don't know the first thing about surviving the gutter." The damp, subterranean chill of the tunnels seemed to press in closer as the autumn rain hammered against the flagstones of the street above, carrying with it the muffled, chaotic roar of a city sliding deeper into misery. Menander turned away from the balance scales, his boots sinking slightly into the packed clay floor as he paced toward the darker recesses of the vault where the bulk reserves were stowed. "If a physician from Kos eventually decides to set up shop down here among the gutters and the dying tenements," Menander said, his voice echoing flatly against the damp brick walls, "he will quickly learn that the sanctuary rules he memorized on his sun-drenched island mean nothing. The Asclepiadian Brotherhood trains its sons to heal kings and wealthy magistrates, who can pay in stamped silver and olive oil. They do not teach you how to stitch a throat cut in a tavern brawl, while 3 different factions of city thugs are shaking you down for protection money." Lysandra carefully sealed a small wax packet of black hellebore, her movements unhurried, precise, and entirely devoid of panic. She slid the packet into a hidden niche behind a protruding course of brickwork before turning her dark, unblinking gaze toward him. "When one of them finally arrives, he will find out that the slums offer the greatest, bloodiest laboratory in the Hellenic world," Lysandra replied, her tone cool and analytical. "A man who spends years in the dissection pits of Kos is not looking for comfort or easy patronage. He is looking for a place to test his limits. And if he ever does set foot near the Dipylon Gate, he will think he brings empirical truth to the masses." She stepped away from the trestle table, running a slender finger along the rim of a large ceramic amphora filled with imported poppy extract. "Think about it," Lysandra continued, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial murmur. "Our distribution network reaches the docks, the potteries, and the outer gates. But we are stretched thin. We spend half our energy dodging the astenomoi and managing the supply lines from Phoenicia, just to keep the clinic stocked with legitimate palliatives. If an idealistic outsider establishes himself near us, the desperate and the dying will flock to him. They will bring him their rotting limbs, their chronic agues, and their deep-seated infections." Menander stopped pacing, leaning his shoulder against a timber-shored support beam as he considered her words. "And when his remedies fail, as they inevitably do when a patient is starving and living in a sewer, he will need a source for stronger sedatives. He will need us." "Exactly," Lysandra said, a sharp, triumphant edge cutting through her words. "He will think he's an independent man of science. But in Athens, science without capital is just a slow form of starvation. When a Kos-trained physician finally arrives, we will watch him. We will let him treat the worst of the slums, let him spend his energy fighting the impossible tides of poverty and plague. And when he realizes that a bronze scalpel cannot cure a hollow stomach or stop a gangrenous rot without our reserves, we will bring him into the fold. He will become our most brilliant asset, or he will vanish into the same, unmarked pit as every other idealistic fool who tried to heal Athens." Up above, the heavy thud of a passing iron-rimmed cart shook dust from the ceiling timbers, showering a light film over the cedarwood chests. Neither of them flinched. In the dark heart of the attic underworld, the wheels of survival, commerce, and control continued to turn without missing a beat. The goddess did not conquer with bronze or chariot, but with the salt-stung prayers of men facing the deep. Long before her altar smoked in the hidden stone alcoves of Athens, Isis had been but a localized whisper along the muddy banks of the Nile, bound to the dynastic rites of pharaohs and the agrarian cycles of the Delta. But when the conquests of Alexander shattered the old borders and threw the Mediterranean open to a frantic, restless web of commerce, she hitched her skirts to the wind and followed the wake of the grain fleets. In an era when every mercantile venture across the Aegean was a desperate gamble against sudden squalls, pirate galleys, rotting timbers, and watery graves, sailors and merchants found themselves stripped of the cold, civic comfort of mainland gods. Traditional deities like Athena or Zeus demanded civic loyalty and bloodlines tied to the soil. They cared little for the desperate foreigner tossing upon a midnight wave. Keep your eyes on the horizon and your prayers to the local lords, a weathered Corinthian captain muttered, gripping the salt-crusted steering oar as a sudden gust of wind heeled the deck over. Athena only listens if you were born within sight of the Parthenon. Out here in the dark, she's deaf to a stranger's drowning cry. We are adrift in a world of ghosts, the master's mate thought, his knuckles whitening as the hull groaned against the rising swells. The old gods belong to the land. When the sea rises to swallow us, the temples ashore cannot hear the water filling our lungs. Thus, men turn to Isis Pelagia, the patroness of the sea. From the sun-bleached quays of Alexandria to the crowded stone wharves of Piraeus, Delos, and Corinth, rough-handed shipmasters carried her name like a vital talisman against the abyss. Before hoisting their canvas or casting off their mooring ropes, captains would pour libations of sweet wine to the Great Mother, painting her sacred symbol, the swelling curve of the ship's stern or the shining disk of the moon, upon the prows of their merchant vessels. Pour deep, master, and do not spill a drop, an old Phoenician hand whispered, guiding the captain's hand as the dark wine splashed across the cedar prow. The Great Mother holds the reins of the storm. If she looks upon the stern, the winds will bend to her will. Where Egyptian wheat, linen, and Ptolemaic gold flowed, the shrines of the goddess followed. They slipped quietly into the bustling maritime gateways of the Greek world, establishing root not in the grand, sunlit agoras of the civic elite, but in the gritty cosmopolitan shadows of the harbors. To the dockworkers, foreign traders, and transient sailors, she offered an anchor in a chaotic, borderless world, proving that a god who could calm the violent tides of the sea could just as easily steady the turbulent waters of human survival. The gods of the old Greek polis were fiercely territorial, jealously guarding their civic boundaries and demanding pure, unmixed bloodlines of worship. But Isis cared nothing for such rigid walls. She possessed the far more potent magic of mirrors. Our altars belong only to those whose grandfathers poured libations on the soil, an aging Athenian priest muttered, his fingers tightening around his ceremonial staff as he cast a suspicious eye toward the foreign quarter. A stranger's prayer is but empty wind to Athena. Let them keep their cold stone and narrow laws, a weary merchant thought, slipping a small bronze amulet of the goddess beneath his tunic as he walked past the temple gates. What good is a patron who demands a bloodline when your children are dying of fever in a rented room? To the Hellenic mind, foreign deities were often viewed with suspicion, yet Isis slipped effortlessly into their sanctuaries by wearing the familiar faces of their own pantheon. When a Greek farmer knelt before her altar, he saw the golden harvest end maternal grief of Demeter. When a young bride whispered a prayer for her hearth, she saw the regal sovereignty of Hera. And when desperate lovers or courtesans sought the favor of passion, they found the alluring grace of Aphrodite shining back from the goddess's dark obsidian eyes. Burn the sweet lotus seed, child, an elder priestess murmured softly, guiding a trembling young bride toward the obsidian shrine. She knows the weight of a neglected hearth. Look into her eyes and see your own sorrow reflected there. She wears the face of Hera, yet her embrace is warmer, the bride thought, her tears falling against the cold stone as she pressed her forehead to the altar. She does not judge a woman's worth by the dowry she brought to her husband's house. She was the goddess with 10,000 names, a fluid, multifaceted divinity, who could be all things to all men because she mirrored whatever humanity projected upon her. In a fractured world searching for certainty, she held the threads of fate, the secret arts of healing, the fierce protection of motherhood, and the unyielding machinery of cosmic order, all within her single embrace. That supreme adaptability became her true conquest. In the smoky, suffocating alleys of the slums, an impoverished mother weeping over a sick child found comfort in the arms of the great grieving goddess who had resurrected Osiris. O Great Mother, you who searched the wild delta for your torn lord, do not let the fever take my boy. The mother sobbed into the dark, her cracked hands clutching a small clay figurine. She hears me, the mother thought, a fierce, desperate warmth flooding her hollow chest, as the flickering lamplight caught the gold-leafed crown of the statue. She lost her own child to the dark. She knows the tearing of a mother's heart. She will not let him slip away. At the same time, in the marble-columned villas of the inner Ceramicus, wealthy magistrates and ambitious elites, looking for a secure anchor of divine patronage, bowed before the very same altar. Grant my motion strength in the assembly tomorrow, Lady of Heaven, and the third of my harvest shall gild your sanctuary, a magistrate whispered, rising smoothly from his private devotions while his slaves waited silently in the colonnade. The city's old gods are drowning in their own petty squabbles, the magistrate calculated, adjusting his embroidered woolen cloak. But Isis commands the loyalty of the docks, the underworld, and the rising elite alike. Aligning with her priesthood is the only true leverage left in Athens. She bridged the chasms of class, birth, and geography, offering a universal refuge to a world that was slowly forgetting how to hope. The old civic cults of the polis were transactional contracts, cold bargains struck between a city and its patrons, where a citizen offered a sacrificial goat in exchange for a favorable harvest or victory in war, remaining an outsider to the divine will. We burn the thigh bones and pour the wine so the assembly stays safe for another year, an aging Athenian magistrate muttered, staring blankly at the smoke rising from the public altar. The gods take their toll and we keep our peace. That is the only bargain there is. A bargain, nothing more, a young soldier thought bitterly, fingering the ragged scar across his ribs as he watched the smoke drift away into the indifferent sky. They care nothing for why we bleed. When the spears shatter, the Olympians are silent. As the Hellenistic age ground away the certainty of the city-state, men hungered for something deeper, something that touched the shivering core of the soul. Thus, the worship of Isis transformed, absorbing the ancient hushed solemnity of the Eleusinian mysteries into secret nocturnal rites guarded by locked doors and solemn oaths. Swear by the veil of the mother that your lips remain sealed to the profane, the presiding priest whispered, pressing the cold edge of a bronze amulet into the initiate's palm as the heavy oak doors groaned shut against the night. There is no turning back now, the initiate thought, his breath catching in his throat as the last sliver of outer moonlight vanished behind the bolted timber. Whatever waits in the dark, I must face it alone. To enter her inner sanctuary was to undergo a terrifying, profound metamorphosis. Initiates pass through rigorous ritual purifications, shedding their worldly identities before descending into symbolic dramas of death and rebirth. They walk through simulated darkness, confronting the absolute terror of the underworld, only to emerge blinking into the golden torchlight, reborn as children of the goddess. Let go of your name, your debts, and your mortal grief, a priestess murmured, guiding the blindfolded traveler down the slick, echoing stone steps. You must die in the dark before you can ever truly live in her light. The cold is absolute. The initiate trembled, his boots sinking onto the damp earth of the subterranean vault, as phantom weights pressed against his chest. I am drowning. I am falling into the void. Then, a sudden blinding burst of golden torchlight cut through the gloom, accompanied by the crashing chord of bronze cymbals. I see her, the initiate gasped, falling to his knees as tears spilled down his cheeks in the sudden warmth. The grave has loosed its grip. I am reborn. In that breathless moment, the promise was forged. She offered not merely a civic blessing, but a deeply personal, transformative salvation, a sacred guarantee that the Great Mother would shield her children through the trials of this life and guide their souls safely past the dark gates of the afterlife. She holds the key to the abyss, Menander whispered quietly to himself in the shadowed corner of the lower sanctum, watching a new wave of initiates rise from the floor with eyes wide with wonder. The state offers execution blocks and tax ledgers. The goddess offers eternity. For those who knelt at her lowest altars and stood in her highest initiations, Isis soon outgrew the crowded, traditional pantheon of Olympus. She ceased to be merely one deity among many. To her devoted followers, she became a supreme, solitary power who held the threads of fate in her hands, a monotheistic sovereign of the cosmos who commanded the stars, tamed the sea, and offered eternal sanctuary to a broken world. The altars of the traditional polis were jealously guarded bastions of elite male privilege, where citizenship and ancestral bloodlines dictated who might draw near the divine. Only freeborn sons of Athens whose names grace the civic registers may approach the sacred precinct, the temple steward announced, waving an imperious hand to clear the steps of the Parthenon. Step back, woman. This ground is not for you. Always the same stone walls, always the same barred doors, an Athenian matron thought bitterly, her fingers gripping the folds of her shawl as she turned away from the sunlit Acropolis. The gods of the city look upon us as little more than chattel to keep their ancestral lines unbroken. But the sanctuary of Isis knew no such walls, drawing its truest strength from the very margins of society. In a world governed by the strict, unyielding laws of the patriarchal household, free Athenian women found within the cult a rare and intoxicating breath of agency. While civic priesthoods were largely closed or relegated to ceremonial pageantry, the Temple of Isis offered women a vibrant, highly visible stage. Here they served as consecrated priestesses bearing the sacred sigilla, led the tearful nocturnal lamentations for Osiris, and acted as wealthy financial patrons, whose private fortunes sustained the sanctuary. "Hold the silver vessel high, sister, and let the sacred water flow," an elder priestess whispered, steadying the younger woman's trembling hands as the temple lamps flickered in the dark. "Tonight, your voice echoes before kings and magistrates alike. I am no longer just a shadow moving silently through the gymnasium," the priestess realized with a fierce, quiet thrill as she raised the bronze bucket before the altar. "Here, my devotion carries the weight of an empire." For a woman whose life was otherwise confined to the dark, silent rooms of the domestic quarters, the goddess provided spiritual authority, intellectual fellowship, and a profound measure of public standing that no civic magistrate could strip away. Yet the embrace of the Great Mother stretched deeper still, reaching down into the filth and desperation of the streets where the city's outcasts struggled to survive. Step across the threshold of her shrine, and the rigid hierarchies of the ancient world dissolved entirely into the incense smoke. Side by side, on the cold marble floor, knelt the chattel slave who had fled his master's whip, the freedman laboring for scraps on the Piraeus docks, the rootless foreign merchant who possessed no voice in the Athenian assembly, and the impoverished citizen broken by debt. "Keep your head down, brother," a scarred freedman muttered, pulling a shivering runaway slave closer to his side as the chanting swelled in the sanctuary. Inside these walls, no man's back bears a master's brand. "I am seen," the slave thought, tears carving clean lines through the suit on his cheeks as the heavy scent of myrrh washed over him. "In the eyes of the mother, I am a living soul, not a broken tool." In the shared devotion of the mysteries, they found a revolutionary kinship, a sanctuary of mutual support, mutual survival, and absolute belonging. To Isis, they were not property, aliens, or the dregs of the slums. They were her children, bound together by a single, unbreakable cord of human dignity. The Olympian gods sat aloof upon their sunlit summits, indifferent to the quiet agonies of mortals, treating human suffering as the mere background noise of epic tales. "Let the mortals cough and bleed in the dirt," a wealthy citizen remarked carelessly over a cup of watered wine near the agora. "The gods busy themselves with the fate of nations, not the petty miseries of beggars and slaves. They sit upon their golden thrones and listen to the wind," Lysandra thought coldly, as she watched a sick child shudder on a fever pallet in the slums. "The Olympians are marble and myth. When the night turns cold, marble offers no warmth." But Isis wept with her children. At the very beating heart of her worship lay an intimate, aching humanity born of her own legendary sorrow. She was the grieving wife who had wandered the desolate earth to gather the scattered, bleeding pieces of murdered Osiris. She was the desperate, protective mother who had hidden in the dangerous marshes of the Delta to shield her infant son Horus from the wrath of death. Because she had known the absolute depths of grief, terror, and loss, she understood every fracture of the mortal heart. "O mother who searched the dark banks of the Nile, look upon my broken boy," a desperate mother sobbed, pressing her forehead against the cool stone base of the statue. She knows this tearing of the soul, the mother thought, feeling an unearthly warmth settle over her shoulders in the dim, flickering shrine. She lost her own. She will not let mine walk the dark alone. That profound empathy became her greatest sanctuary. Along the painted walls of her shrines hung the aretalogies, stamped tablets, and parchment scrolls inscribed with public testimonies of miraculous healings, where the blind, the fever-ridden, and the broken recorded their salvation. To the sick, the weary, and the destitute staggering through the cold Athenian night, she was no distant statue of gold and ivory. She was a living, breathing presence who listened to whispered prayers in the dark, offering a tender, merciful refuge to a harsh and unforgiving world. The goddess did not enter Athens by decree of the archons, nor with the blare of trumpets through the Dipylon Gate. She arrived in the hold of a grain ship wrapped in the smell of rotting bilge water, salted fish, and crushed papyrus. Keep the cargo moving before the customs scribes wake up, a weary shipmaster barked, wiping the salt spray from his eyes as his crew heaved a heavy amphora onto the stone wharf of the lower Piraeus. We have crossed the grave itself to bring this wheat, the master thought, his hand brushing against the small bronze amulet of the cow, horned goddess hidden inside his tunic. The magistrates in the upper city sleep safe behind their marble columns, knowing nothing of the terrifying gulf we just cheated. The spread of the cult of Isis into the Attic heartland was a slow subterranean infiltration, carved out not by state policy, but by the relentless tides of commerce, migration, and human desperation. Long before her altars were permitted under the pale marble of official civic sanctuaries, her worship took root in the darkest, most salt-crazed corners of the Piraeus. It began at the quays. As hulking merchantmen from Alexandria and distant Phoenician ports ground their hulls against the stone wharves of the lower harbor, foreign sailors, weary medics, and rootless ship hands stepped ashore, carrying more than just amphorae of wheat and bales of linen. In the quiet, damp hours before dawn, they carried their gods. The local priests tell us our foreign rites are banned from the public agoras, a foreign merchant muttered, setting down a heavy pouch of silver coins among a circle of ragged dockworkers. Let the city keep its proud temples, the merchant thought, a grim resolve tightening his jaw. Athena does not care for the stranger drowning in the dark. But the Great Mother remembers every sailor who looks to the stars. To the proud Athenian magistrate, the city's pantheon was a closed ancestral guild of native Olympians who demanded pure bloodlines and civic pedigree. But a sailor battered by the winter gales of the Myrtone Sea cared little for ancestral prestige. He needed a power that walked the waves. In the shadowed spaces between the warehouses, where foreign merchants pooled their meager, hard-earned silver, informal associations, Thiasoi began to take shape. Pour the sweet wine slow, an elder sailor whispered, guiding a young, trembling deckhand's hand as dark red vintage spilled over the cracked stone floor. She watches the stern post when the breakers rise above the mast. I can still hear the roaring of the swells from last night's squall. The young deckhand trembled, staring into the flickering flame of a tallow lamp. She pulled us through that black wall of water. She is real. There, hidden behind stacked timber and sailcloth, they built their first shrines to Isis Pelagia. In those cramped, flickering alcoves, men with salt-crusted skin and heavy foreign accents knelt in the dark, pouring libations of sweet wine, and praying to the Great Mother to tame the treacherous abyss, planting the first, quiet seeds of an empire of faith right at the gates of Greece. The grand, white-columned temples of the Athenian Acropolis stood as monuments to an exclusive glory, their sacred enclosures jealously guarded by elite bloodlines and a civic pride that had long since forgotten the common man. Only citizens whose names are recorded in the ancestral demes may pass the inner gate, the temple guard barked, his spear barring the polished marble threshold as a ragged laborer approached with a meager handful of copper coins. Go back to the gutters. The Olympians do not bargain with dirt. Let their marble columns crumble into dust, the laborer thought bitterly, turning away as the bitter taste of exhaustion burned his throat. The gods up there live on smoke and privilege. They do not know what it means to starve in the dark. To the city's outcasts, crushed beneath decades of relentless political upheaval, grinding economic strain, and social fracture, those traditional sanctuaries offered nothing. The old Olympians demanded pedigree, wealth, and unblemished civic standing. They had no ears for the desperate cough of a slum dweller, or the silent weeping of a woman trapped within the stifling walls of the Gymnasium. Thus, the cult of Isis found its truest home in the dark, fever-ridden alleys of the Potter's Quarter and the suffocating shadows near the Dipylon Gate. It spread not by decree or public pomp, but by the quiet, urgent contagion of word of mouth. Down in the mud where the city's underbelly struggled to draw breath, the goddess became a lifeline for the discarded. Here, kneeling side by side on the damp earth behind locked doors, knelt the chattel slave who had fled a brutal master's whip, the freedman laboring for wretched copper coins at the docks, the exhausted seamstress, and the wife whose world was bounded by a single windowless room. Keep your head down and your voice low, a scarred freedman whispered, pressing a small clay cup of oil into the trembling hand of a runaway slave in the cramped subterranean chamber. In this room, no man owns your back and no master counts your scars. Is she truly listening? The slave wondered, staring into the flickering flame of the terracotta lamp, while the sound of municipal guards patrol marching overhead sent a shiver through the earthen walls. In the eyes of the city, I'm only a broken chattel. But here I am counted among the living. In a society built on rigid walls and ruthless hierarchies, the shrine of Isis offered a revolutionary grace. The goddess asked for no ancestral tree, no stamped silver, and no civic title. She offered profound emotional empathy to those who wept in the dark, personal salvation to those living on the razor's edge of survival, and a fierce, unbreakable community that ignored every line drawn by the state. She demands no pedigree, only a broken heart, an elder priestess murmured, tracing the sign of the moon across the forehead of a weeping seamstress. Lay your grief upon her altar, child. The mother carries what the world casts away. She knows the weight of sorrow, the seamstress thought, her tears finally breaking free as she pressed her forehead against the cool stone. She does not ask whose house I belong to. She only asks if I'm hurting. What had begun as a rough sailor's charm muttered against the sea storms quietly evolved into an underground sanctuary for the desperate heart of Athens. A subterranean pulse beating steadily beneath the decaying marble of a dying empire. In the claustrophobic labyrinth of the Ceramicus, where illicit trade, raw medical palliatives, and shadow-drenched smuggling networks formed the only viable currency of survival, the worship of Isis wove itself seamlessly into the daily pulse of the underworld. Keep the crates of poppy resin tucked behind the altar alcove, Menander murmured, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted the heavy timber paneling that concealed the floor vault. If the municipal inspectors come sniffing around again, all they must smell is frankincense and burning myrrh. Let the city magistrates think we are nothing more than a ragged collection of superstitious outcasts, Menander thought, wiping a smear of dark resin from his fingers as distant footsteps echoed on the flagstones above. They look at the smoke and see piety. They are completely blind to the real machinery keeping the city breathing. Here, the cult did not hide in the open light of the civic agora. It thrived in the cramped, breath-heavy spaces where law and order dissolved into desperation. For figures like Menander, operating covertly within the concealed arteries of the city, the sanctuary of Isis became an exquisite mask. To the prying, suspicious eyes of the city magistrates and their municipal patrols, the quiet, incense-thick chambers behind locked wooden doors appeared as nothing more than harmless, eccentric religious devotion. A place where pious outcasts muttered prayers and burned cheap oil lamps. Yet that veneer of sacred piety was a masterclass in misdirection. Behind those bolted doors, the hushed liturgies and solemn gatherings masked a far more tangible, complex web of power. The incense smoke blunted the sharp chemical tang of raw opium and stored henbane hidden in the floorboards. The rhythm of ritual chanting drowned out the coded whispers of cargo runners, corrupt customs officials, and underground doctors negotiating terms. The port guards on the night shift won another 2 drachmas per amphora, or the next Asian shipment stays impounded, a scarred cargo runner whispered, leaning heavily against the altar base as Lysandra handed him a small packet of dried palliatives. Let them demand their bribes, Lysandra calculated internally, her dark gaze fixed on the flickering oil lamp. We fold their greed into the cost of the sacred offerings. Every coin they extort finds its way back through our network, binding them tighter to our altars than any oath ever could. It bound the city's fractured underbelly together with an unbreakable glue of mutual support, illicit commerce, and clandestine alliances. By wrapping her eternal, comforting promise of resurrection, bodily healing, and safe passage through the dark in an airtight shroud of absolute discretion, the great goddess of the Nile completed her quiet conquest. She ceased to be a foreign river divinity carried on the wind. She became the beating, secret spiritual heart of Athens' darkest corners, presiding over a world that the Olympians had long since abandoned. Deep beneath the flagstone of the Ceramicus, where the oil lamps burned low, and the air tasted of old earth and scorched myrrh, Menander stood ready to usher another soul across the threshold of the abyss. Draw the iron bolt, Menander instructed in a low, flat whisper, gesturing to the heavy timber door. If the city magistrates hear so much as a breath of what happens tonight, every priest and smuggler in this quarter will hang from the Piraeus wall before the new moon. Beside him, the high priestess, a tall, severe woman named Piraeus, whose silver-trimmed robes, whispered against the damp floor, nodded once. Her face, hardened by years of surviving the shadows of Athens, remained carved in stone. Before them stood the initiate, a young fugitive whose name and past had just been stripped away at the outer gate. "Step forward into the dark," urged the cult's keeper of the veil, a weathered priest named Diodorus, placing a heavy bronze sistrum into the shaking hands of the novice. "You entered this place clinging to your worldly skin. You will leave it, if the Great Mother wills it, reborn in her light." The initiate stumbled forward, his boots sinking into the wet soil of the subterranean vault, as the heavy oak door groaned shut behind him, sealing away the last sliver of the outside world. Absolute, crushing darkness enveloped him. The cold is absolute, the initiate thought, his chest heaving as phantom weights pressed against his ribs, and the mocking whispers of the underworld seemed to echo from the damp walls. "I am drowning. I am falling into the void." "Swear," Charis's voice cut through the blackness like a razor, cold and unyielding. "Swear by the veiled face of the Mother that your lips remain sealed to the profane, that no torture or gold will ever wrench her sacred liturgy from your tongue on pain of eternal damnation." "Roman I swear," the initiate choked out, his voice trembling in the void. "Let go of your name," Menander murmured softly from the darkness beside him, his hand steadying the novice's shoulder. "Let go of your debts, your masters, and your mortal grief. You must die in the dark before you can ever truly live in her light." Then, with a sudden crashing chord of bronze cymbals, the hidden wall of the sanctuary slid open. A blinding burst of golden torchlight flooded the vault. Blinking against the sudden brilliance, the initiate fell to his knees as the haunting scent of lotus and sweet oil washed over him. Standing before the obsidian altar, her hands raised in eternal blessing, was Charis, while Diodorus struck the sacred rhythm once more. "I see her," the initiate gasped, tears carving clean lines through the suit on his face, as a fierce, unearthly warmth flooded his hollow chest. "The grave has loosed its grip. I am reborn." Before the first gray streak of dawn had pierced the smog hanging over the Ceramicus, Menander was already awake, moving through the shadowed, silent corridors of the subterranean sanctuary. While the upper city of Athens still slept, cocooned in the cold privilege of its ancestral gods, the true pulse of the underground began with the breaking of the light. Menander pushed open the heavy inner door, carrying a fresh ewer of spring water and folded bolts of bleached linen, stepping into the cool, incense-heavy sanctum where the statue of the Great Mother stood. Waiting by the altar in the dim glow of a single oil lamp was Charis, her silver-trimmed robes catching the faint light, alongside the weathered priest Diodorus. "The night has passed without the city watch, discovering the lower drainage seals," Menander whispered, setting the linen and water down upon the stone slab before the goddess. "The Mother watched over the threshold," Charis replied softly, her hand steady as she untied the worn outer veil of the cult statue. "Now we welcome the day." Together they performed the sacred morning ablutions. With meticulous care, they washed the dust of the underworld from the obsidian hands of the goddess, anointing her stone fingers with fragrant oils before wrapping her in fresh, immaculate linens. As Diodorus struck the bronze sistrum in a low, rhythmic chime, Menander poured the first libation of sweet wine across the altar base. "O Lady of the shore and sovereign of the deep," Menander murmured, his head bowed against the cool stone, offering the dawn prayer for the outcasts, the refugees, and the smugglers who depended on this hidden sanctuary to survive another day. "Let the magistrates look to their marble temples above," Menander thought, watching the first amber ray of sunlight slip down the ventilation shaft to kiss the golden crown of the statue. "Our day begins in the dark, but we hold the heart of Athens in our hands." To be continued in episode 13, Illyrian, Chaff, and the Coin. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Talesia's Playlist. Volume 2, Hieroslachus, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.